The mask behind the empire. The world knew him as Caleb Vance, a name synonymous with wealth, vision, and calculated brilliance. His face had graced the cover of Fortune magazine more than once, and Wall Street analysts tracked his every move like astronomers studying constellations. At 35, Caleb wasn't just a self-made millionaire. He was a symbol of relentless ascent, a man who built a financial empire from the ashes of a childhood spent in foster homes and hand-me-down clothes. But for all his visibility, for all the spotlight that came with private jets, luxury summits, and gala invitations scribbled in gold foil, very few people had ever truly seen him. The irony of it all was suffocating. Caleb sat in the dim light of his private study, the skyline of Chicago glittering behind him like 1,000 fake stars. A brand-new Armani tuxedo hung untouched on a valet rack beside the bookshelf. His assistant had arranged every detail for tonight's prestigious Angels for Tomorrow fundraiser, a high society charity gala attended by CEOs, philanthropists, and media giants. Caleb's name was on the donor wall. His company had pledged a staggering $3.5 million to the Children's Neurological Research Fund. And yet, he wanted nothing more than to vanish. He rose, walked to his wardrobe, and bypassed the suit his team had selected. Instead, he pulled out a soft gray wool sweater, one he hadn't worn in years, and paired it with dark slacks and worn-in leather shoes. His assistant would have gasped if she saw him stepping out like this. But he didn't care. He wasn't going as Caleb Vance, CEO of Orion Holdings. Tonight, he was just a man, a guest, someone looking for a space where no one measured his worth in dollars. He left through the private elevator to avoid the press. No entourage, no cameras, no chauffeured Rolls-Royce. Just Caleb in a regular car he rarely used anymore, driving through the city like he used to before people began recognizing him at every turn. The gala was already underway when he arrived, a sprawling event hosted at the illustrious Varden Hotel, a place so exclusive even the carpets were rumored to cost more than a car. He entered through the side, past security with a discreet nod to the event badge he'd printed under a pseudonym, and walked into the main ballroom. It was opulent, almost offensively so. Crystal chandeliers stretched toward the heavens, live classical music floated across the air, and guests swirled in silks and tuxedos like a choreographed dream. But Caleb didn't notice any of that. His eyes moved across the room, not for opportunity, but for silence, for that one moment of peace he'd come seeking. No one recognized him, no curious stares, no eager introductions. He was invisible, and for the first time in years he felt like he could breathe. He wandered through the sea of conversation and clinking glasses, stopping only when he reached a quieter corner of the venue. A long buffet table dressed in soft linens and adorned with artful desserts so stunning, he instinctively leaned closer. Each item was a masterpiece: mango domes shaped like pebbles, chocolate tuiles that curled like waves, raspberry mousse nested in spun sugar baskets. He didn't know much about pastry, but even he could tell these weren't just sweets. They were someone's soul in edible form. He heard a quiet voice, calm, focused, giving instructions to a young server. A woman in a black chef's uniform was meticulously arranging the final platter, tucking a sprig of edible flowers beside a citrus tart. Her brow furrowed in concentration, and her fingers moved with the steady grace of an artist. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply present. "That lemon twist," Caleb said without thinking. "You placed it like a signature." The woman looked up, slightly startled, then smiled when she realized he was admiring her work. "You noticed," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Most people don't." "It's not just food," he said. "You've crafted something intimate. These pieces, they feel personal." The woman chuckled softly, not out of courtesy, but from genuine surprise. "Are you a chef?" He shook his head. "No, I'm just someone who notices when something's made with care." She wiped her hands on a towel and offered hers. "I'm Nora, head pastry chef for tonight's event." "Caleb," he said simply, choosing not to give a last name. It felt better that way. They shook hands. Her grip was firm but warm. There was no attempt to impress, no flicker of recognition in her eyes, and no hesitation in her smile. For a man used to the calculated politeness of social climbers, it was disarming. Nora nodded toward the dessert display. "Most people here care more about the calorie count than the craftsmanship, but thank you, this is everything to me." "You made all this yourself?" he asked, unable to keep the admiration out of his voice. "Every piece," she said. Our team helped with plating and prep, but I do the design and assembly. It's been a long week. Worth it, he said, truly. A pause hung between them, not awkward, just natural. For the first time in ages, Caleb wasn't calculating ROI, wasn't predicting where a conversation might lead. He was just there, with her. "Would you maybe walk with me?" he asked, motioning toward the garden patio outside the ballroom. "If you have a moment." She glanced at the finished table, satisfied with its perfection, then back at him with a gentle nod. 10 minutes won't hurt. Outside, the cool night air embraced them. The garden was lit with soft amber lights, casting gentle shadows on the cobblestone path. The sounds of the gala melted behind the closed doors. Out here, it was just them and the rustling of leaves. Nora breathed deeply, eyes closed for a second. "You know what I love most about nights like this? The contrast. Inside, it's diamonds and champagne. Out here, it's just air and sky." Caleb looked at her, quietly amazed. She was eloquent without trying, thoughtful without pretense. "I grew up in Inglewood," she said, not waiting for him to ask. "Single mom, worked 2 jobs, didn't have time for birthday cakes, let alone French pastry. But I always remembered the smell of cinnamon from a neighbor's kitchen. It made me believe that life could be sweet, even if it wasn't easy." Caleb listened, not as a millionaire, not as a public figure, but as a man hearing something real. "My mother used to say," she continued, "find the thing that brings you peace and then find a way to give it. Baking did that for me, so now I give it." He was quiet, his throat tight with something he hadn't felt in years, connection. "And you," she asked, tilting her head. "What do you do, Caleb, who notices details?" He smiled. "Investments, real estate, mostly boring stuff." "Is it boring to you?" she asked simply. "No," he said, "but lately it's felt hollow." Nora looked at him for a moment longer, as if reading something behind his words, then nodded. "Then maybe you're ready to build something else." The comment struck deeper than she knew. He wanted to ask how someone like her could cut through the layers he'd spent years hiding behind. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood beside her in silence, watching the wind move the branches overhead. For once, he didn't feel like a man being hunted for his wealth. He felt human, and it terrified him. And yet, he didn't want the moment to end. End of part 1. Shall I continue with part 2? It will dive deeper into Caleb's emotional turning point as he starts questioning his purpose, and Nora's simple but powerful life begins to shift something inside him, a longing to be part of something real. Let me know, and I'll begin part 2 immediately. The morning after the gala unfolded with an unfamiliar quiet in Caleb Vance's life. Not the kind of quiet that came from silence, but the kind that followed a night when something in the soul had been stirred, when a simple conversation had slipped past every defense he had spent years building. He stood in the kitchen of his penthouse suite, dressed in plain navy sweats, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as the sunlight cast warm strips across the marble countertop. He wasn't thinking about acquisitions, meetings, or the overseas call he had deliberately rescheduled. Instead, his mind wandered, uninvited and unstoppable, back to the terrace, to the woman in the black chef's coat whose laughter felt like it hadn't been filtered through ambition or networking instinct. He tried to remember the last time someone spoke to him without trying to angle toward an opportunity. It wasn't easy. In his world, even silence was strategic. But Nora. She had been something else entirely, grounded, unfiltered, real. His team was already buzzing through his inbox, messages about a stalled deal in Miami, a zoning issue in Portland, a sponsorship pitch from a tech startup looking for capital. But Caleb wasn't reaching for his phone. He was staring at the skyline as if it were a mural of someone else's life. For a moment, he tried to shake it off, chalk it up to a fleeting fascination, a mental detour. But when he caught himself smiling at the thought of raspberry tarts and signature lemon twists, he realized it was more than that. Something had been planted in him, and no matter how much logic he poured on top of it, it was growing roots. He found himself on the couch, laptop open, browser filled with tabs, not finance, not stocks, not high-rises or hedge funds, but bakery reviews. Midtown, uptown, Brooklyn, searching for names, searching for her. "Nora," he typed softly, then paused. No last name, no clue, only her voice, her honesty, and the memory of her saying, "We're talking about opening a second location in Brooklyn." That was the only breadcrumb he had, and that was enough. An hour later, he was in his car again, not chauffeured this time either. Just Caleb behind the wheel, dressed simply, headed into a part of the city that smelled like morning ambition and fresh dough. The bakery was tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. The sign above was hand-painted. Whisk and Bloom. Small, cozy, personal. He knew the moment he saw the gentle curves of the letters, and the small raspberry vine painted beneath them, that this was her place. Inside, the air was a symphony of scents: vanilla, orange zest, warm bread, caramelized sugar. There was no sleek, sterile design here, just wood-paneled warmth, shelves of fresh loaves, handwritten menus, and a soft hum of indie music playing in the background. A couple of young baristas worked the counter, serving coffees and greeting customers with genuine smiles. But it wasn't until Caleb saw her, her back turned, hair tied up messily under a bandana, piping chocolate onto eclairs, that his chest tightened. He hesitated. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking, this, simply walking up to a woman who didn't know his last name, felt like stepping into unknown terrain. But then she turned, looked up, and her face lit up, not with recognition of his status, but with the simple joy of seeing someone she remembered from a genuine moment. "Caleb," she said, drying her hands, "you found me." "Didn't even know I was looking until I started driving," he replied, surprised by the truth in his own voice. She gestured to the stools by the window. "You want coffee or something sweet?" "I came for the coffee," he said with a smirk, "but I'm starting to think the real draw is the company." Nora laughed and disappeared behind the counter, returning with 2 steaming mugs and a small plate of lemon shortbread. "My favorite," she said, sitting across from him. "These are dangerous. I only allow myself one a day." He took a bite and his expression said everything before words did. "I see why," he murmured. She smiled but didn't rush the conversation. There was a comfort between them already, a thread of familiarity woven in the quiet space between 2 people who didn't need to impress. Finally, Caleb leaned back and asked, "So why Whisk and Bloom? The name, I mean." Nora's eyes softened as she looked around the shop. "My mother loved gardening, said everything good in life needs time and nurturing, whether it's roses or relationships or recipes. I used to watch her prune flowers before dawn, and she'd whisper to herself like she was having private conversations with the petals. I think that's how I learned patience. And whisk, well, that's me. The movement, the mix, the magic. Together it felt balanced." He nodded slowly. "It's beautiful, the story, the meaning, all of it." Nora studied him then, not with curiosity, but with quiet intuition. "You seem different today," she said. "Lighter somehow." He hesitated. "Maybe I am." "You're still not going to tell me what you actually do, are you?" she asked, teasingly but without pressure. "I told you," he replied. "Real estate investments." "But you didn't tell me why you needed to hide at a gala under a false name," she said, eyes twinkling with mischief. He froze for a heartbeat, then laughed. "Fair point." "Don't worry," she added. "You don't owe me an explanation." But Caleb found himself wanting to give her one anyway. "My life's full of noise," he said, staring at the window as rain began to dot the glass. "It's a room with 1,000 voices, and every voice wants something. Money, access, association. It's like I became this vending machine of opportunities. Insert flattery, receive favors." Nora didn't interrupt. She listened, truly listened, and that was something Caleb had almost forgotten how rare it was. "Last night," he continued, "for the first time in years, I was the guy. I was just a guy, and you talked to me like I wasn't valuable for what I could give you. That hasn't happened in a long time." She rested her elbow on the table and her chin on her palm. "So what are you going to do about it?" The question hit like a soft wave, not cruel, not prying, just open, honest. And suddenly, Caleb didn't want to go back to the noise, not just yet. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it starts with showing up here more often." Nora laughed again, but this time it was laced with something warmer. "You'd be welcome. Just don't expect me to treat you any different if you decide to confess you're secretly a Wall Street tycoon." He grinned. "What if I'm worse than that?" "Oh God, don't tell me you're a politician." He nearly choked on his coffee. "Now that's offensive." They both laughed, the kind that lingered in the air like cinnamon, and Caleb realized something he hadn't dared admit until now. This bakery, this conversation, this woman, they weren't distractions. They were lifelines. Reminders that beneath the towering buildings he owned, beneath the endless metrics and media appearances, there was still a man who craved meaning more than margin. And in the presence of Nora, whose world was simpler but no less profound, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And perhaps, if the stars continued to align, something even more dangerous. Desire, not for ownership, but for belonging. It was the kind of internal fracture that couldn't be seen from the outside, the kind that didn't bleed or break bones but quietly cracked the way a man understood his own life. Caleb Vance stood on the 46th floor of Orion Holdings, his corner office wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the beating heart of the Chicago skyline. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood polish and espresso, and his executive assistant moved through it like clockwork, announcing schedules, signing off vendor agreements, and reminding him of a dinner with investors in Milan next Thursday. It was all so polished, so well-oiled, so hollow. He nodded where expected, signed where required, and dismissed the team with his usual composure. But the moment the door closed and silence reclaimed the room, Caleb loosened his tie and exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath since morning. Everything around him had been designed for status. Furniture curated by Italian designers, abstract art chosen by gallery scouts. Even the pens on his desk were limited edition Montblancs. And yet none of it sparked anything in him anymore. Not like the soft curl of Nora's smile when she described her mother's garden. Not like the warmth of her shop, where sugar and sincerity blended in ways that not even money could fake. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the skyline. For years, he had lived by the architecture of ambition. Every move calculated, every friendship weighed, every interview rehearsed. He had become fluent in the language of boardrooms and venture rounds, in press kits and quarterly forecasts. But ever since that night on the terrace, since that morning in the bakery, his thoughts no longer obeyed the schedule his calendar dictated. They wandered unapologetically toward the girl in the apron, toward a scent of cardamom, toward conversations that made him feel not important but understood. That evening he stood in front of his wardrobe again, not in search of perfection but in search of simplicity. He pulled on a navy Henley shirt, dark jeans, and that same worn pair of boots. He didn't need to check the mirror. He wasn't dressing to be seen. He was dressing to show up. Nora was behind the counter when he arrived at Whisk and Bloom, and her expression lit up in a way that made something in Caleb's chest both soar and ache. Not because it was romantic, though something was blooming slowly and inevitably, but because it was genuine. There was no calculation in her gaze, no weighing of who he was or what he could offer. She was just happy he came back, and that, more than any deal he'd ever closed, felt like a victory. "Hey, stranger," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "I was just about to start another batch of hazelnut brioche. You're welcome to watch, unless you're afraid of flour." "I'm afraid of a lot of things," Caleb replied, smiling as he stepped behind the counter. "Flour isn't one of them." She handed him an apron, and he stared at it like it was an invitation to a world he hadn't earned entry into. But she nodded encouragingly, and he slipped it on. They worked side by side, measuring, folding, kneading. Nora explained how the dough needed to be treated gently, how even the slightest misstep in proofing could throw off the rise. Caleb listened, asked questions, laughed when he fumbled with the rolling pin, and at some point, somewhere between the melted butter and the laughter, they stopped being from different universes. For a few fleeting hours, they were just two people in a kitchen, one sharing her art, the other finding sanctuary in it. As the evening wound down and customers thinned, Nora brewed a pot of loose-leaf tea and set 2 cups by the back window where the moonlight spilled through the glass. They sat in silence for a while, sipping and watching the world slow down. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Anything," Caleb answered, meaning it more than he realized. "Why does it feel like you're always on the edge of disappearing?" Her voice wasn't accusing, only curious. Caleb looked down at his hands, hands that had signed contracts worth millions, hands that had built and defended an empire, hands that now rested on a table beside a woman who didn't care about any of that. He had told 100 half-truths in his life, concealed his name at galas, underplayed his wealth in conversations, even disappeared from events just to preserve his peace. But now, under the warmth of her question, in the gentleness of her gaze, he couldn't retreat. "I spent most of my life building something people would respect," he began slowly. "I thought that if I just got high enough, enough buildings, enough headlines, enough control, then maybe the noise would go away. But it didn't. It only got louder. I'm surrounded by people all the time, but I've never felt lonelier. And then I met you." Nora didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. She simply listened. "And in that moment," he continued, "I felt seen, not for the name, not for the wealth, just seen." "I see you now," she said gently. It hit deeper than he was ready for. The simplicity, the sincerity, It made him want to be honest about everything, to tell her who he really was, what he owned, what he controlled, and how fragile it all felt compared to the way she looked at a piece of pastry like it was sacred. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. So he looked at her and whispered, "Thank you." And that was enough for that night. But the storm of truth was coming. The next morning, Caleb was back in the boardroom, seated at the head of a 14-person strategy session. His CFO was presenting quarterly revenue trends, and his legal team discussed upcoming legislative changes in tax structuring. It was business as usual, but Caleb's mind was still covered in flour and cardamom. He barely registered the numbers on the screen. Instead, he kept thinking about how Nora's bakery wasn't just a storefront. It was a cathedral of care, a place where people found joy without needing to impress anyone. "Mr. Vance," someone said, jolting him back to the room. He cleared his throat. "Sorry, continue." But his distraction didn't go unnoticed. After the meeting, his longtime COO and closest professional confidant, Valerie Hawthorne, entered his office and closed the door quietly. "Something has changed," she said, standing with her arms crossed. "You're here, but not really. Want to tell me what's going on?" Caleb hesitated. Valerie had been with him since year one. She had seen him hustle, fail, rebuild, rise. If anyone deserved his honesty, it was her. "I met someone," he said, watching her reaction closely. Valerie raised an eyebrow. "That's a first." "It's not like that," he added quickly. "She's not from this world." "Ah," Valerie said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Hence the distraction and the absence and the baking powder on your sleeve yesterday." He laughed softly. "I didn't even notice." Valerie smiled, but it faded quickly. "Does she know who you are?" "No," he admitted. "And how long do you think that's going to last?" "I don't know," he said. "I'm not hiding forever. I want a little more time. Time to be someone without the shadow of my name." Valerie walked to the window, looking out over the city. "Caleb, I've watched you for 10 years claw your way to this view, but if you've found something or someone, that makes you forget about the climb for even 5 minutes. Don't let it slip. Just don't build it on a lie." Her words landed softly, but they echoed long after she left. Caleb sat alone, the skyline staring back at him like a mirror. He had mastered the language of power, but in Nora's world, authenticity was the only currency that mattered. And every day he let her believe he was just another guy in dark jeans. The line between honesty and betrayal blurred a little more. He knew the time would come to tell her everything. He just didn't know if, when he did, she'd still look at him the same way. There was something different about the way the light entered Whisk and Bloom that morning. A haziness filtered through the clouds, casting a soft, gray shimmer on the glass and wood surfaces inside the bakery. Nora had arrived early, earlier than usual, before the city even woke, her footsteps echoing alone across the quiet kitchen floor. She claimed it was to perfect a new almond fig scone recipe, but deep inside, she knew it was something else that pulled her here, the same restless hum that had started to coil in her chest over the past few days. A question she hadn't quite allowed herself to speak, something about Caleb. He'd been coming by the bakery nearly every other day now, not just for coffee, not just for the pastries. He helped close up once, wiped down tables without her asking, even tried folding pastry boxes and ended up using far too much tape. She laughed about that for hours. He had asked about her favorite books, shared that he had once played piano before life got in the way, and even confessed a love for rainy days. Every moment they spent together felt safe, real, intimate in a quiet, sacred way. And yet there was something missing, not in how he looked at her, but in the spaces where most people offered fragments of their past, their story, their world. Caleb was always careful, always diverting. She knew he worked in real estate, but never mentioned the name of his firm. She once asked if he had family nearby, and he had said not anymore before quickly changing the subject. She didn't want to push, not then, not when every minute with him felt like unwrapping something rare. But still, the silence around his life was beginning to echo louder. That morning, after placing the trays in the oven and setting the timer, she opened her laptop and typed Caleb Real Estate Chicago into the search bar. It was a guilty impulse. But the thing about instincts, especially a woman's, is they don't need proof to whisper. They just know when something's off. She stared at the results, scrolling page after page, seeing dozens of names, but none with his face. She leaned back in her chair, sighing. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe he really was just a man trying to escape the noise, just like he said. But somewhere in the high-rise towers on the other side of the city, Caleb wasn't escaping the noise. He was drowning in it. That morning had begun with a media leak. Some anonymous blog had somehow discovered that Orion Holdings was considering a controversial bid for a neighborhood redevelopment project that threatened to displace hundreds of low-income families. The public outrage was immediate. Caleb hadn't even approved the bid. It was a scouting suggestion by one of his regional managers, but it bore his company's name and, by extension, his face. His phone wouldn't stop vibrating. His inbox had exploded. Reporters were camping outside the lobby. And all he could think about was how Nora would see it. He sat in the backseat of his town car, not driving today, not with cameras everywhere, wearing his most inconspicuous baseball cap and hoodie, heart-pounding not because of the headlines, but because of the clock. He was supposed to meet Nora at the bakery by 10 a.m. She was preparing a small private tasting for a potential investor for her second location, and she had invited Caleb to join. "I value your opinion," she had said, and something in her tone made it clear that it wasn't just about the pastries. She wanted him there, beside her, as someone whose presence gave her strength. He couldn't be late, not today. When he finally arrived, 20 minutes late, breathless and rattled, Nora was waiting by the counter, her apron still dusted with flour, but her expression unusually quiet. He smiled the way he always did, that soft, crooked smile that only appeared around her, but this time she didn't smile back. "You okay?" he asked, stepping closer. She nodded slowly. "I could ask you the same." There was a silence, heavier than usual. "I saw the news," she added finally, her voice neutral. Caleb froze. "It's complicated," he said, almost automatically. "That's what people always say when they've got something to hide," she replied, her voice still calm but cool now, like a blade dipped in water. "I didn't approve that deal," he said quickly. "My team scouted it without consulting me. I'm handling it now." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something deeper, disappointment. "What team, what deal, what company, Caleb?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. The truth pressed against the walls of his chest like a dam about to burst. "I should have told you," he whispered. She didn't say anything, she just waited. "My name is Caleb Vance," he said finally, his voice low. "I'm the founder and CEO of Orion Holdings. We own real estate developments across 15 states. I've been in Forbes, I have security teams, PR people, lawyers, and I didn't tell you any of that because I was scared you'd look at me the way everyone else does." Nora took a slow breath, stepped back, arms crossed now. "And how do people look at you?" "Like I'm a commodity," he said. "A title, a trophy. No one ever asks me what I want, they just assume I have it all." "And what do you want?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "Peace, honesty, you." The silence that followed was not filled with anger. It was worse. It was filled with hurt. The kind that comes from a fracture between two people who had built something fragile, only to find it was balanced on a fault line. "I let you into my world," she said, barely above a whisper. "I let you see all of me, my story, my dreams, my failures, and you let me believe you were just a guy who liked pastries." "I am that guy," he said. "With you, I was more myself than I've been in years." "But you weren't honest," she replied. "You didn't trust me with the truth." He reached out gently, but she stepped away. "I need time," she said. "Not because of who you are, but because I don't know if I can trust who you've been with me." He nodded. He didn't argue, because she was right. And that's what made it worse. He left the bakery quietly that day, the door chiming softly behind him, but to Caleb, it sounded like a bell tolling the end of something sacred. Outside, the cameras were still chasing his shadow, reporters still shouting questions, his phone still buzzing with crisis updates. But all he could feel was the absence of a woman who made him feel human again. Back at Orion, the fallout over the neighborhood bid continued. Caleb made the decision to scrap the project entirely and reallocate the funds into affordable housing, a move that stunned the press and left his board fuming. But he didn't care. It was the first time in years he made a decision based on principle rather than projections. He also declined 3 speaking events, canceled a feature interview with a finance magazine, and ghosted a private invite to an island resort hosted by billionaires. Because none of those places mattered now. Not when the one place he truly wanted to be, the place with mismatched chairs, handwritten menus, and the smell of warm vanilla, was now unsure whether he belonged there. That night, Caleb stood alone on his rooftop, city lights stretching endlessly below him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel victorious. He felt stripped, empty, but in that emptiness there was something honest. Painful, yes, but honest. Sometimes, when you spend your whole life building towers, you forget what it means to kneel. Nora hadn't returned Caleb's messages in 4 days, and to him it felt like he had been walking barefoot across glass for an eternity. Each morning since he confessed the truth, he would wake up before sunrise, hoping, half expecting, that maybe she would text him with a line as simple as "I need coffee" or "You're still invited to Brooklyn." But her silence remained intact, not angry, not bitter, just quiet. And it was that quiet that stung the most. He didn't deserve her words yet. He knew that, but still, the weight of not hearing her voice pressed against his chest like a stone he couldn't remove. Meanwhile, her world kept moving. Whisk and Bloom opened every day like it always had. The customers came, the ovens glowed with warmth, and the scent of almond, cinnamon, and brown butter filled the air like armor against the hurt she was trying so hard to push through. But even the most perfect croissant couldn't distract her from the ache inside her chest, the one that whispered how much of it was real. She didn't know how to process the contradiction. Caleb had lied to her by omission, yes. But he had also shown up with flour on his sleeves, rolled dough beside her, tasted her creations with reverence, and looked at her like she was more than the sum of her ingredients. Could both truths coexist? Could someone deceive you and still mean every word they spoke? Late one evening after closing, Nora sat alone in the bakery kitchen, the lights dimmed, her hands still dusted with flour. She stared at a tray of lemon tarts that didn't taste right, though the recipe hadn't changed. It was her mind that had, her heart. She hated that her thoughts kept circling back to him, but it wasn't just about Caleb's wealth. It was about the way he used it or didn't. She remembered now moments she hadn't questioned before. How he once paid for a broken coffee grinder without blinking. How he offered to sponsor a new oven through a contact. How he seemed strangely fluent in business lingo even while claiming to work in boring property management. The signs had been there, and she had ignored them because, deep down, she had wanted the fairy tale, the ordinary man with extraordinary eyes who saw her work as art and her voice as truth. Across the city, Caleb was trying to figure out how to rebuild something without control. All his life, when a company failed, he pivoted. When a deal crumbled, he acquired something better. When a building caught fire, literally or metaphorically, he sent in a team. But none of those tools worked here. He couldn't buy back her trust. He couldn't pitch her forgiveness. He couldn't draft a contract for sincerity. All he could do was show up different, better, patient. So that's what he did. On the 5th morning before sunrise, he walked into the bakery quietly, not through the front door, but through the side alley where Nora's assistant Maya usually brought in flour deliveries. He had called her the night before, not to manipulate, but to ask if he could help. Not as a CEO, not as a man in love, but as someone who had wronged someone good. Maya, who had always liked Caleb, hesitated, then told him to meet her at 5:45 a.m. sharp. And so, at 5:42 a.m., Caleb stood by the back entrance in an old sweatshirt and jeans, holding 2 crates of fresh lemons. When Nora entered from the front, she was too tired to notice him at first. It wasn't until she walked into the prep area and saw him arranging pastry boxes near the flour bin that her breath caught. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm not here to talk," Caleb said calmly but gently. "Not unless you want me to. I'm here to work, just that." Nora looked at him like he had stepped out of a dream and into a place he didn't belong. "You're not a line cook." "No," he said, lifting a bag of almond flour. "But I'm a good listener, and I know how to sweep floors." She wanted to tell him to leave. Her pride said she should, but something about the way he moved, not too careful, not performative, just honest, stopped her. So she said nothing, and he stayed. That morning passed in an odd silence, but it wasn't bitter. It was full of small observations. Caleb watching how she folded pastry edges with her thumb, Nora catching how he wiped counters twice, even after they were already clean. They didn't speak beyond logistics. But every time their hands brushed, something unspoken passed between them, regret maybe, hope maybe more. It became a rhythm. Caleb returned every morning at dawn before the bakery opened, before the customers arrived. He never overstayed. He never pressed her to talk. He helped scrub pans, carry crates, and mop the kitchen floor with sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He never tried to be charming. He just showed up. And Nora, against her better judgment, started to let him. One afternoon, a week into this unspoken truce, Maya approached Nora as they restocked the display fridge. "He's been here at 5:45 a.m. every day," she said. "I've seen men with less commitment to their weddings." Nora smirked despite herself. He's persistent. He's genuine, Maya said. I mean, I know he messed up, but whatever he's trying to build now, it's not fake. You can see it in how he watches you when you're not looking. Nora didn't reply, but her silence was no longer filled with anger. It was something else, something softer. That evening, Caleb was packing up to leave when she stopped him by the back door. He turned, surprised, unsure if she needed something. But she was just standing there, arms crossed lightly, apron still dusted with flour. You've been here every day, she said. I told you, he replied. I'll keep showing up as long as you let me. I haven't forgiven you, she said. I know. I'm still angry. I deserve that. But, she paused, breathing in deeply, I don't think you came here to fix your reputation. I think you came here because this matters to you. Caleb nodded. It does, you do. There was a long beat. Then she looked down almost shyly and said, The raspberry glaze you made yesterday, it was actually better than mine. He blinked, stunned. Really? She smiled for the first time in a week. No, but you needed that. And for the first time in days, they both laughed. And in that laughter, something cracked open again, not completely, not yet, but enough. Come tomorrow, she said, but don't wear that shirt, it's hideous. Yes, chef, he said, grinning. That night when Caleb went home, he didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like he had won her back. He felt humbled. And in that humility, something new took root, something not based on power or presentation, something that could, in time, become love. Not the fast kind. Not the storybook kind. But the kind forged in silence, apology, and earned trust. For a time, it felt like the world had slowed to allow space for them to mend. There was no grand gesture, no sweeping romantic climax that fixed the fracture. It was quiet, almost mundane, a slow rebuild of something precious through shared labor and subtle glances, through silent mornings filled with whisking and flour and 1,000 things left unsaid. But perhaps that was the only real way trust returned, not in a flood, but in drops. Caleb no longer asked for forgiveness. He earned moments instead, moments when Nora handed him a tray without hesitation, moments when their laughter came freely, not forced, moments when she no longer avoided his gaze but met it and held it, steady and searching. The city, however, was not built to keep secrets, and neither was the press. In the beginning, Caleb's appearances at Whisk and Bloom went unnoticed, shielded by the early hour and the humble nature of the shop. But the buzz around his sudden shift in behavior had already begun inside the upper floors of Orion Holdings. Journalists were hungry for a fresh story after the public outcry over the housing deal. Investors whispered that Caleb had become distracted. And when one freelance blogger caught a photo of him exiting the bakery's back alley with his sleeves rolled up and powdered sugar smudged on his jeans, the story wrote itself. Billionaire bakes bread, inside the mysterious mornings of Caleb Vance. The headline exploded within hours. First came the gossip columns, then the business magazines, then the national outlets who spun the story as either a crisis of identity or a billionaire's eccentric phase. Speculation spiraled. Was Caleb investing in a food empire? Was Whisk and Bloom a secret front? Was he dating the owner? Was this a calculated PR move to humanize his image? Everyone had a theory. No one had the truth. Caleb saw the article while he was helping Nora slice citrus for a seasonal tart. His phone had buzzed 3 times in a row, and when he glanced down at the notification from Bloomberg and read the title, his heart sank like an anchor. He didn't even have to show Nora. She felt it before he said a word, the change in his posture, the way his breath hitched. What is it? She asked, setting down the knife. He turned the phone toward her. She read the headline, the subtext, the comments scrolling already by the hundreds, and then her face changed. Nora had weathered challenges before. She had handled undercooked batches, supply chain delays, and relentless critics. But this was different. This wasn't about food. This was her privacy, her bakery, her name, dragged into a storm she never asked for. Did you know this was coming? She asked slowly, quietly. No, Caleb said immediately. I swear I've kept everything under wraps. I've turned down interviews. This wasn't supposed to happen. She nodded, but her hands trembled slightly as she moved to the sink, rinsing them with a kind of mechanical focus. They called me a quiet love interest and said I'm part of some PR stunt, she whispered. People are tagging my shop's account asking if I'm selling billionaire pastries. I'll make a statement, Caleb said. I'll shut it all down, I'll tell them. No, Nora interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. She turned, eyes flashing with a mix of fear and fury. You don't get to control this like one of your board meetings. This is my life, Caleb, my business, my name. He stepped back not out of offense, but out of respect. You're right, he said softly. The bakery door jingled then, and two customers walked in, phones in hand, their eyes darting between Nora and Caleb with unmistakable curiosity. Nora inhaled deeply, pushed back her shoulders, and walked toward them with practiced grace, the kind that came from years of holding herself together when everything inside wanted to fall apart. Caleb didn't stay long after that. He left through the back alley again, not because he was ashamed, but because he refused to give anyone another photo. For the first time, he realized what his presence could cost her. Back at Orion Holdings, his PR team was in a full panic. Statements were drafted, a press conference was proposed, even Nora's Bakery was offered a strategic brand partnership that Caleb shut down before the sentence finished. But damage control wasn't what he wanted. He didn't care about his image. He cared about her. So he went quiet. He stopped visiting Whisk and Bloom, not out of retreat, but out of respect. He didn't call. He didn't text. For a man who had once built an empire with sheer persistence, this time he stepped back, not because he gave up, but because sometimes love meant making space. Nora, for her part, didn't reach out either, not because she had closed the door completely, but because the noise outside was too loud to hear her own thoughts. Every day brought new attention. Her shop saw a wave of curious customers, social media influencers taking selfies beside the display case, customers asking if she would start signature billionaire cupcakes. It was exhausting. But underneath the chaos, what hurt more was the quiet, the absence of the man who used to arrive at dawn, who swept the floors like it was sacred, who once stared at her raspberry tarts like they were a miracle. 3 weeks passed. Then one morning a box arrived at Whisk and Bloom. No logo, no signature. Inside was a single handwritten note and a check tucked beneath it. For the ovens you said you needed. No branding, no interviews, no expectations, just help and hope. See. Nora stared at the note for a long time. The check was for exactly the amount she had quoted months ago in passing, $42, $600 for the upgraded ovens that would cut prep time in half. No fanfare, no leverage, just quiet support. She didn't cash it. Not yet. But that evening, as the shop emptied and the sunset painted gold across the floor, she sat at the back table and read the note again. And this time, she smiled. Because even without being in the room, Caleb had found a way to show up. Some truths don't explode. They echo, lingering in the quiet corners of a heart that's trying to decide whether it dares to trust again. For Nora, those weeks after the media storm didn't just test her patience. They tested her belief in what was real, what was good, and what kind of love, if any, could survive exposure to the world's noise. The bakery hadn't collapsed under the pressure. In fact, business had surged, sales tripled, and her online following ballooned overnight. Yet the success didn't taste sweet. It tasted like compromise. Like her quiet world had been painted over with someone else's brush. And all the while, the man whose smile once lit her kitchen at sunrise had disappeared, not ghosted, not fled, but stepped back with a silence so deliberate, it felt louder than any declaration. She hadn't called him. She hadn't returned the check either, but she hadn't cashed it. It sat in a drawer beneath the register, folded beside the note he'd written in that strong, certain handwriting. No expectations, just help and hope. Every time she touched it, her fingers tingled with the memory of his hands kneading dough beside hers, of his laughter filling the kitchen when he messed up the cinnamon rolls, of how his eyes softened when she spoke about her mother's garden. She tried to convince herself that the silence was for the best, that maybe their worlds really were too different. But even after all the press died down and the attention shifted to the next scandal, the ache of his absence didn't fade. It only deepened. Caleb, meanwhile, had never been more visible in public and more invisible in spirit. The board at Orion had renewed confidence in him after his sharp handling of the media mess. The company's stock rebounded. He delivered a compelling keynote at a summit in Vienna, turned down a TV interview in favor of a published op-ed about economic responsibility, and was offered a cover shoot by Time. He said no to the photo, but yes to the article. When the journalist asked if he was dating anyone, he simply replied, "Not at the moment, but I've never met someone more real than her." That line never made the print edition, maybe because it didn't fit the image. But for Caleb, that one sentence carried more truth than every press release he'd ever approved. And then came the envelope. It was late one Friday night when Caleb returned to his penthouse, exhausted, suit jacket slung over one shoulder, the city glittering behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like a mirage. The doorman had handed him a small envelope earlier. No sender, no stamp, just his name in blue ink. Caleb opened it slowly. Inside was a single handwritten note and a business card from Whisk and Bloom. On the back of the card were 6 words. "You still make terrible raspberry glaze." He didn't smile, he exhaled. Deep, long, grateful. The next morning, he didn't wear a suit. He didn't bring a driver. He didn't rehearse what to say. He woke before the sun, pulled on a soft wool sweater, and drove himself through quiet city streets to the one place that had taught him how to be human again. When he arrived, the bakery lights were already on. He stepped inside slowly, cautiously, like someone returning to a church where he wasn't sure if he was welcome. The shop looked the same, warm, intimate, the scent of vanilla and orange peel still dancing in the air. But there was something else now, a stillness, an invitation. Nora stood behind the counter, her back to him, finishing a tray of morning buns. She didn't turn at first. She just said, "You're late." He paused, then smiled softly. "Traffic." "Liar," she said, and finally looked over her shoulder. Her apron was still dusted with flour. Her eyes were the same, steady, assessing, but softer now. Not a wall, a door. "I wanted to come every day," he said, "but I didn't want to make it harder." "It was already hard," she said. "You just made it honest." He nodded, not defending, not explaining, just accepting. "I never asked for your world," she continued. "Never cared about your company or your skyline or your last name. I cared that you saw things no one else noticed, that you looked at a tart like it was art, that you listened like it mattered." "I do," he said quietly. "And I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Because when the world looked in, I thought you'd run to protect your image." "I didn't care about the image," he said. "I only cared about the damage I caused by being part of your life. I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't," she said. "You just surprised me." A pause, thick with everything that hadn't been said. Then she took something from under the counter and slid it toward him. A tray of raspberry tarts. "Try one," she said. "Let's see if your taste has improved." He picked one up with a shaky laugh, took a bite, and closed his eyes. "It's perfect," he said. "Liar," she replied, but she was smiling now, truly smiling. Then she stepped around the counter and stood in front of him, hands at her sides. "You still haven't asked me," she said. "Asked you what?" "If we're okay." He looked at her then, not with apology, not with pity, but with awe. Because despite everything, his lie, the media, the world, she still stood there, heart cracked but open. "Are we?" he asked, almost afraid to hope. She reached for his hand, gently. "We could be, if you promise me one thing." "Anything." "No more disappearing, no more pretending, and no more raspberry glaze." He laughed, pulled her close, and for the first time in months, maybe even years, felt like he was standing in a life that made sense. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. That night they closed the shop together. No reporters, no social media posts, no headlines, just a woman wiping down a counter and a man sweeping the floor beside her. Two people who had learned that love wasn't a perfect story. It was a choice, made every day, earned through patience, forged in honesty. And sometimes found where you least expect it. In a quiet bakery. Before dawn,